Number 1. Herxheim. In the flat farmland of southwest Germany, near a village called Herxheim, archaeologists opened the ground and found something that still divides the experts who study it. The date is around 5000 BC, and the people who lived here were among the very first farmers in Europe. We call them the linear bandceramic, the linear pottery culture, and in the standard story, they are the gentle pioneers of the continent, the ones who traded the spear for the seed and the hunting camp for the longhouse. What they left in the ground at Herxheim does not fit that story at all. Around the settlement ran 2 curving ditches, not dug once, but dug and refilled again and again, and into them went the broken remains of human beings. The minimum count is around 500 people. Some later estimates push it close to 1,000. That is a small town's worth of the dead, gathered in one place. The bones tell you how they were treated. The skull vaults were carefully worked into cups. The face and the base were removed, leaving a smooth bowl of bone, and this was done the same way every time, which means someone knew exactly how to do it. The rest of the skeletons carry cut marks at the muscle attachments. The long bones are cracked open for their marrow, and some fragments show the kind of damage you get from chewing. The archaeologist Bruno Bullistan looked at all of this and argued, in 2009, that the simplest explanation is cannibalism. These people were processed like animals for meat. Not everyone agrees. Andrea Zeblons, who directed the wider excavation, reads the same bones as a huge act of ritual, a gathering of the dead from many communities to be destroyed and buried together. The pottery supports part of that, because it comes from a wide area, so people or their remains were carried here from far away. A third, weaker idea is famine, ordinary hunger driving people to the unthinkable. What no one disputes is the timing. Herxheim sits right at the moment the linear pottery world collapsed, around 5000 BC, and it is not the only site from that moment soaked in violence. The skull cups take real skill, and skill means practice, and practice means this was not a single night of horror, but something people had learned to do. If the first farmers of Europe were capable of this, the word civilized starts to feel very thin. And it turns out the shaping of human heads was not unique to them. Number 2. The Ofnet Cave skull nests. Move a few thousand years earlier and a little to the east to a cave called Ofnet in the Nördlinger Ries of Bavaria. In 1908, an archaeologist named Robert Rudolf Schmidt dug into the cave floor and found 2 round pits. Inside them, packed tightly together, sat somewhere between 33 and 38 human skulls. They were not scattered. They were arranged, most of them facing the same direction, toward the southwest, and every one of them had been drenched in red ochre until the bone glowed rust red. People who have seen the deposit describe it as heads packed together like eggs in a nest. The date is late in the Mesolithic, roughly 7 to 8,000 years ago, a time when this land belonged to hunter-gatherers, not farmers. 2 details make Ofnet dark. The first is who these people were. The skulls belong mostly to women and children. Adult men are strangely absent. The second is the damage. Many of the remaining neck vertebrae carry cut marks, which means the heads were deliberately removed from the bodies and cleaned of flesh. And a number of the skulls, especially those of adult women, show crushing wounds from something like a mace or a stone axe, delivered around the time of death. So these were not people who died quietly and were honored later. Many of them were killed. Here is where the interpretations split. The oldest reading calls this a head cult, the product of a massacre in which a community's women and children were killed and their heads kept as trophies. Perhaps the men were away, and raiders fell on the camp. A gentler reading says, these are the venerated dead, skulls of loved ones gathered, painted, and reburied with care, with the trauma coming from some separate event. The ornaments complicate everything. Perforated red deer teeth and shells were found with the heads, the kind of thing you wear or offer, not the kind of thing you throw into a mass grave. The truth may be that both readings are right at once, because trophy-taking and reverence are not opposites. A head can be a prize and a relic in the same hands. Whatever happened, the careful ochre and the southwest orientation tell you this was ritual, done with intent, one of the earliest clear cases of organized violence in post-glacial Europe. And if you think heads in a nest is as far back as the darkness goes, the next site pushes it almost unimaginably deeper. Number 3. Gran Dolina. In the hills of Atapuerca, near Burgos in northern Spain, there's a place where a railway cutting sliced through an ancient cave and exposed layer after layer of deep time. The Spanish team working there, led by Eudald Carbonell, José María Bermúdez de Castro, and Juan Luis Arzuaga, reached a level they call TD6. Using the flip of the Earth's magnetic field and the animals fossilized alongside, they dated it to at least 800,000 years ago. This is the early Pleistocene, a world before our own species existed. In 1997, they announced that the human remains here belong to a new species entirely, which they named Homo antecessor. And those remains were not buried, they had been eaten. At least 11 individuals were identified, and most of them were children and teenagers. Their bones carry exactly the same marks as the butchered animals found in the very same layer. There are cut marks at the joints and muscle attachments from skinning and taking the limbs apart. There are percussion pits and fractures where the bones were cracked to get at the marrow inside. The human and animal refuse are mixed together, which tells you the clearest possible thing. These people were treated as food. This is the oldest widely accepted evidence of cannibalism anywhere in the human family, and it sits almost at the base of our genus. The researchers argue this was not a single act of starvation. The evidence repeats through the deposit, which suggests it happened more than once, that it was in some sense normal. One influential interpretation calls it war cannibalism, the eating of rival groups, a practice that fed the body and marked the territory at the same time. The youth of the victims fits this, because the dead may be the children of outsiders, caught and consumed. To make the case airtight, the team compared the human bones directly against red deer, horse, and bison from the same beds, and the treatment matched. Before Atapuerca, the accepted origins of cannibalism sat far younger. Gran Dolina pushed them back roughly threefold in a single stroke. It is very hard to keep believing that humanity started brutal and slowly grew gentle when the eating of children appears this close to the beginning. And our nearest cousins, it turns out, did the same. But before the eating, we have to talk about the killing, and one African lakeshore preserves the oldest planned attack we know of. Number 4. The Nataruk Massacre. West of Lake Turkana, in the hot, dry north of Kenya, a Cambridge team led by Marta Mirazon-Lar and Robert Foley published a discovery in the journal Nature in 2016 that reopened one of the oldest arguments in anthropology. At a place called Nataruk, they found the remains of at least 27 people who died around 10,000 years ago, at the very end of the Ice Age. This was not a cemetery. The bodies lay where they fell, on what was then the marshy edge of a lagoon, and they were never buried at all. Among them were men, women, and children, and one of the women was heavily pregnant. 10 of the skeletons show clear signs of a violent death. There are skulls crushed by heavy blows. There are broken hands, knees, and ribs. There are sharp force wounds to the head and neck. Embedded in some of the bodies were points and blades made of obsidian, a black volcanic glass, and that detail matters more than it first appears, because there is no obsidian at Nataruk. It had to be carried in. The attackers arrived equipped, with weapons made and transported in advance. Several of the dead appear to have had their hands bound. The pregnant woman may have been bound at the hands and feet when she died. This is not a brawl. This looks like a planned raid on a band of people, and the Cambridge team argued it is among the earliest scientifically documented cases of warfare between human groups. The find landed straight in the middle of a very old debate. On one side is the idea associated with Rousseau that early humanity was peaceful and that war is a disease of civilization. On the other is the darker Hobbesian view that violence was always with us. Nataruk hands ammunition to the pessimists, and it does something more specific. The land here at the time was rich, full of fish and game, so this was not desperate people fighting over the last scraps. Some archaeologists have pushed back, asking whether the injuries really prove a coordinated raid, or whether some damage came after death, and the original team has defended its reading in detail. But the combination of bound hands, imported weapons, and whole families killed together is hard to explain as anything gentle. Warfare, it suggests, is older than farming, older than cities, older than property itself, and sometimes the violence was not aimed outward at enemies at all, but turned, with terrible precision, on the living skull. Number 5. Neolithic trepanation. Trepanation is the deliberate cutting of a hole in a living person's skull, and it is the oldest surgery we know of. The clearest early examples date to around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, in the Neolithic, though some candidates reach back even further. A skull from Herxheim in France, dated to roughly 5,100 BC, carries 2 openings, and at least one of them shows the smooth, remodeled edges that only form when a person survives and the bone heals. That single detail is the most astonishing part of the whole story. People lived through this. The methods varied. Some practitioners scraped the bone away layer by layer. Some cut a groove in a circle until the disc lifted free. Some drilled a ring of small holes and connected them, and some simply cut a square and removed it. The tools were flint, obsidian, and later metal, and the operation was done on a fully conscious patient. Thousands of years before anesthesia. Thousands of years before anyone understood infection. Yet the healed margins prove that survival was common, and in some places, remarkably so. In the Andes, cultures such as the Paracas and later the Inca practiced trepanation so widely that some cemeteries show survival rates that would rival an early modern hospital. A number of skulls were opened more than once and healed each time. Why do it? The answers divide into the medical and the ritual. On the medical side, it may have relieved pressure from a fractured skull after a blow to the head, or been an attempt to treat headaches, seizures, or madness. On the ritual side, it may have been meant to let out evil spirits, and some of the removed discs of bone, called rondelles, were pierced and worn as amulets, which points to meaning beyond medicine. The 19th century anatomist Paul Broca was the one who first recognized that these prehistoric patients had genuinely survived, reading the story straight from the healed bone. Modern surgeons have even recreated the procedure with flint to measure how long it took and how dangerous it was. Regional styles suggest the knowledge was taught and passed down, a real surgical tradition. Some of the trepanned skulls belong to children, which raises questions we would rather not sit with. It forces us to abandon the lazy assumption that ancient people were helpless before the body. They cut into the conscious human head on purpose, and their patients often walked away. Sometimes, though, the violence was not one skull at a time, but a whole community at once, thrown together into a single pit. Number 6. The Talheim Death Pit. In 1983, in the town of Talheim in southwest Germany, someone doing ordinary garden work uncovered a pit full of human bones. When archaeologists examined it, they found the remains of at least 34 people, tangled together where they had been thrown. About 16 were children and adolescents. The other 18 were adults, men and women alike. The date was around 5000 BC, the same terminal moment of the linear pottery culture that gave us Herxheim, and the story the bones tell is brutally simple. These people were murdered. Almost all of them were killed by blows to the head, and the pattern of the wounds is telling. Many of the strikes landed on the back or the side of the skull, which means the victims were struck while fleeing or while already down and helpless. This was not a battle between two lines of warriors. It was an execution, and the wounds carry a signature. The shape of many of the injuries matches the distinctive linear pottery stone adze, the tool archaeologists nicknamed the shoe-last chelt because of its long, narrow form. In other words, the killers used the same everyday implements as their victims. These were farmers killing farmers. At least 2 of the dead also carry arrow injuries. Once they were killed, the bodies were tipped into the pit without care, with none of the arrangement or grave goods that normally marked a linear pottery burial. The physical anthropologist Joachim Wahl led the study that matched the weapons to the wounds, and Talheim became one of the anchor sites for a disturbing idea that the first farming culture of Europe did not simply fade away, but ended in bloodshed. It stands alongside Aspern-Schletz in Austria and Herxheim as evidence of that violent collapse. What drove it? The leading ideas are competition for land and resources as the good soils filled up, drought pushing communities into conflict, and cycles of feud and revenge. Strontium isotopes in the wider set of these massacre sites suggest some victims were not local, which fits raids between communities. Whatever the cause, Talheim shows organized, community-scale killing thousands of years before the first city, the first king, or the first metal sword. It reframes the Neolithic not just as the age when we learned to farm, but as the age when we learned to fight over fixed ground. And Europe was not alone. On the other side of the world, an even larger grave holds an even darker scene. Number 7. The Crow Creek Massacre. On a bluff above the Missouri River in South Dakota stood a fortified village of the people we call the Initial Coalescent, ancestors of the Arikara. Around the year 1325, something catastrophic happened there. In 1978, erosion and looting exposed a mass grave in the village's defensive ditch, and when archaeologists excavated it, they recovered the remains of at least 486 people. It is one of the largest massacre deposits ever found in North America, and the number is close to the entire population of the settlement. Men, women, and children of every age were killed together. The trauma on the bones is extensive and deliberate. Many skulls carry the circular and linear cut marks left by scalping, made when the scalp is cut away from the crown of the head. There is evidence of decapitation, of dismemberment, and of crushing blows. In a number of individuals, the hands, feet, noses, and even tongues had been cut off. This was not merely killing. It was mutilation carried out with intent, the same kind of trophy-taking and bodily desecration seen in violent societies around the world. And the bones show one more grim detail. Weathering and the gnaw marks of animals reveal that the bodies lay exposed for weeks before anyone gathered them into the ditch, which suggests the survivors, if there were any, could not return for a long time. The village had been built for defense, with a ditch and a palisade wall, which tells you the threat of attack was not a surprise, but a chronic condition of life on the northern plains. The skeletons also carry signs of stress before death, malnutrition, and infection, hinting that the community was already weakened, perhaps by a period of climate stress that squeezed the farmland everyone depended on. The researchers who documented the trauma, including P. Willie and Thomas Emerson, laid out a picture of intense warfare between villages over food and territory, warfare that could end in the annihilation of an entire settlement. The remains were later reburied under repatriation agreements with descendant communities. Crow Creek shatters any romantic notion that pre-contact North America was a land without organized violence. It shows ideologically charged, large-scale killing in a farming society that had no state, no empire, and no written law. And if a whole village could be wiped out by its neighbors, our next site shows a family destroyed by an even more intimate horror. Number 8. Sidrón. In a limestone cave system in Asturias, in the green north of Spain, lies a place called Sidrón, where a single event nearly 50,000 years ago was frozen in time. The Neanderthal remains here date to around 49,000 years ago, and they belong to at least 13 individuals. There were adults, adolescents, children, and one infant. Genetic and dental study revealed something that makes the site hit harder than any statistic. These people were a family. The adult males were related to one another, while the females came from different lineages, a pattern that tells us about how Neanderthal groups were structured. And this family met a single, terrible end. The bones carry the unmistakable marks of butchery. There are cut marks where the flesh was stripped, fractures where the long bones were broken for marrow, and damage where the skulls were opened for the brain. The processing is identical to the way animals were prepared for eating. Whether this was survival cannibalism in a desperate winter, or a ritual act, or something in between, the physical evidence is clear that these Neanderthals were eaten. They apparently died together and were then washed by a collapse into a lower gallery of the cave, which sealed them and preserved them as a group, and that is why we can be so confident they belong to a single event. Sidrón is famous for another reason. Before the era of high-quality ancient genomes, this cave produced some of the best preserved Neanderthal DNA in the world, studied by researchers including Carls Lalueza Fox and Antonio Rosas. The calculus hardened on their teeth, preserved traces of their diet, and even of self-medication, with compounds linked to poplar, the natural source of the active ingredient in aspirin, and to a kind of mold. Defects in their tooth enamel show they suffered episodes of hunger in childhood, hinting at a hard life lived under pressure. And Sidrón does not stand alone. At Mula Gersi in France, at Krapina in Croatia, and at Goyet in Belgium, where butchered Neanderthal bones were even reused as tools, the same pattern appears across Europe. This sits uncomfortably beside the modern picture of Neanderthals as sensitive, caring, symbolic beings, because the truth is that both are real at once. The same people who medicated their sick and cared for their young also, sometimes, ate their own dead. Not every death in the deep past was violent, though. Some of it was astonishingly lavish, and stranger for it. Number 9. The Sunghir Burials. Near the Russian city of Vladimir lies Sunghir, an Upper Paleolithic site excavated from 1955 by the archaeologist Otto Bader, and it contains some of the richest Ice Age graves ever found. They date to somewhere between 30 and 34,000 years ago. The most famous grave holds 2 children, laid out head to head, and what covers them is almost beyond belief. Their bodies were adorned with roughly 10,000 beads, each one carved individually from mammoth ivory. The labor represented in those beads runs to thousands of hours of skilled work. Alongside the children lay spears made from mammoth tusks that had somehow been straightened, a technical feat we still do not fully understand, along with carved ivory animals and ornaments made from pierced fox teeth. A nearby adult man was buried with around 3,000 beads of his own. The graves raise a question that has no comfortable answer. This much wealth, poured into the burial of children, does not happen by accident. One reading is that these children inherited high status, that theirs was a society already dividing itself into ranks, where some were born important. But there is a darker possibility that some scholars have raised, that children this lavishly treated may have been chosen, singled out, and ritually killed, their elaborate graves a mark not of privilege, but of sacrifice. The evidence does not settle it, which is precisely why it is the kind of idea that rarely reaches a textbook. One of the children had short, bowed thigh bones, a sign of a physical disability, which complicates any simple story that status followed strength or health. Ancient DNA added a twist. The 2 children were once assumed to be siblings, but the genome showed they were only distantly related. The same genetic work, published by Martin Sikora and colleagues in 2017, used Sunghir to reconstruct the social world of these people, and it revealed something remarkable. Their small bands deliberately avoided close inbreeding by exchanging mates with other groups, which means they had social rules, networks, and an awareness of kinship far more sophisticated than we once assumed. The beads themselves are nearly uniform, produced to a standard, almost like a proto-industrial workshop. Sunghir stands as a centerpiece in the debate over when human inequality began, and it holds honor and possible horror in the very same graves. Was this the tenderest of burials, or the aftermath of a sacrifice? We cannot yet say. But one preserved body, found in an English bog, shows the pattern of ritual killing, whole and undeniable. Number 10. Lindow Man. In 1984, peat cutters working at Lindow Moss, a bog near Wilmslow in Cheshire, England, pulled a human foot from the machinery, and then a body. He became known as Lindow Man, and sometimes affectionately as Pete Marsh. Radiocarbon dating places him around the 1st century AD, in the late Iron Age, on the edge of the Roman conquest of Britain. The acidic, oxygen-starved peat had preserved him with astonishing completeness. His skin, his hair, his neatly trimmed beard, his fingernails, and even the contents of his stomach. He was a healthy man in his mid-20s, well-fed, and his manicured nails suggest he had done little hard manual labor in life. He was, in other words, someone of standing. His death was anything but gentle. The injuries suggest what researchers call an overkill, a killing carried out several times over. He was struck hard on the head, at least twice. His neck may have been broken. A thin cord was tightened around his throat like a garrote, and his throat was cut. This layering of lethal methods has led many to see a ritual pattern, sometimes called a triple death, that echoes descriptions of sacrifice in much later Celtic sources from Ireland and Wales. His final meal was a griddle-cooked bread or cake made from grain, a detail that some have tried, speculatively, to link to the selection of a ritual victim. Traces of mistletoe pollen in his gut have been connected, and also debated, to Druidic ritual. Then his body was placed face down in a pool in the bog, deliberately, not dropped by accident. Lindow Man does not stand alone. Across northern Europe, the bogs have given up other bodies with the same story written on them. The Talheim Man and the Graubaal Man in Denmark, the Ude Girl in the Netherlands, Old Croghan Man in Ireland. Many of them killed in ways that go far beyond simple execution. The Roman writer Tacitus described how the peoples of Britain and Germany killed and offered victims in bogs and sacred groves. Interpretations of Lindow Man divide between human sacrifice, ritual execution, and punishment, but the sheer excess of his death pushes most researchers towards sacrifice. The British Museum conserved him, and his study helped invent the modern science of reading a bog body. Some caution that the triple death may be overread, that a single savage execution could leave similar marks. But his high status and careful grooming raised the unsettling possibility that he was a chosen victim, perhaps even a willing one. He gives the whole subject a face, a named man killed 3 ways and laid in the dark water, and he leads us straight to the question underneath all of this. Lay these 10 cases side by side, and a pattern emerges that is impossible to unsee. Violence and ritual killing appear at every stage of the human story, in every kind of society. They are there before farming, on the lakeshore at Nataruk. They arrive with farming, in the death pits of Talheim and the ditches of Herxheim. They appear among complex hunter-gatherers, in the graves of Sunghir and the skull nests of Ofnet. Cannibalism stretches from Homo antecessor at 800,000 years, through the Neanderthals of El Sidrón, all the way up to the first farmers of Europe. There is no single moment when humanity turned brutal, because there is no moment when we were not. This cuts against a very old and very comforting idea. The philosopher Rousseau gave us the noble savage, the notion that early people lived in gentle harmony and that violence is a sickness introduced by civilization. The opposing view, associated with Hobbes, holds that the natural state of humanity was a war of all against all. The archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, in his book War Before Civilization, argued that scholars had spent decades explaining away the evidence of ancient conflict because it did not fit the peaceful picture they preferred. The sites in this video suggest he had a point. Warfare was not invented by kings and empires. Trophy-taking and massacre appear on multiple continents in societies with no state at all, and the causes refuse to reduce to one thing. Sometimes it was scarcity, sometimes territory, sometimes ritual, sometimes status. What makes the record truly human, though, is that the brutality never stands alone. The same El Sidrón Neanderthals who ate their dead also carried medicine in their teeth. The same Sunghir people who may have sacrificed children buried them with breathtaking artistry. Tenderness and horror occupy the same graves, the same caves, the same bogs. The peaceful past is partly a modern projection, a story we tell because we want our origins to be innocent. The evidence, patchy and hard as it is, keeps insisting on something more complicated. Our ancestors were not gentler than us, and not more savage. They were us, capable of all of it. Which raises an obvious question. If the evidence is this clear, why does so little of it reach the books we hand our children? The answer is partly about the kind of story a curriculum wants to tell. History, as it is usually taught, follows a tidy arc. The rise of civilization, the march from stone tools to cities to writing. Each step an improvement on the last. Ritual cannibalism and the massacre of children do not fit that arc. They interrupt it. A textbook has limited space and a young audience, and there is an understandable reluctance to fill a chapter with scalped skulls and shaped skull cups. Graphic violence against women and children is genuinely hard to teach, and much of this evidence is exactly that. There are deeper sensitivities, too. Many of these dead have living descendants, and the ethics of studying and displaying human remains have rightly become stricter, shaped by repatriation frameworks like the one that returned the Crow Creek dead to their descendant communities. Museums curate for comfort as much as for truth, building exhibits that families can walk through without distress. Words like cannibalism and human sacrifice carry so much sensational baggage that careful researchers often reach for softer language or say nothing at all. And the science itself is genuinely contested. The disagreement between Bruno Boulestin and Andrea Zieblans over Herxheim is not a failure of scholarship. It is honest caution in the face of ambiguous bones, and that caution naturally softens how the story gets told. There is also a long shadow here. In the colonial era, the label of savage was used to dehumanize living peoples and justify terrible things, so scholars today are wary of anything that might romanticize or demonize the past. All of these pressures are reasonable. Together, though, they produce a strange result. Real, well-documented evidence gets reduced to a footnote rather than a chapter, and the phrase too brutal for the books turns out to be partly editorial and partly ethical rather than a matter of doubt. The evidence is not hidden. It sits in journals and museum stores, quietly shelved. The distinction worth holding on to is the one between suppressing the truth and simply handling it with restraint. So it is fair to ask what the bones can actually prove, and where honest science has to stop. The tools archaeologists use to read ancient violence are sharper than most people realize. Cut mark analysis can distinguish the clean, purposeful marks of a stone blade from the ragged damage of decay or a scavenging animal's teeth. A crucial control, used at Herxheim and Gran Dolina alike, is to compare the human bones directly against butchered animal bones from the same site. If the two match, the case for butchery of people gets very strong. Trauma can often be sorted into wounds inflicted around the time of death and damage that happened long after, which is how researchers argue that Nataruk's victims were killed rather than merely disturbed. Other methods reach past the violence into the lives behind it. Healed margins on a trepanned skull prove the patient survived. Strontium and oxygen isotopes locked into tooth enamel reveal whether a person grew up locally or came from far away, which is how we know some massacre victims were outsiders. Ancient DNA can reconstruct kinship, telling us that El Sidrón was a family, and that the Sunghir children were not the siblings we assumed. The hardened calculus on ancient teeth preserves diet and even medicine. Improved radiocarbon methods pin down dates that once floated free. But there are limits, and honest science names them. Bone can tell you that a person was killed and eaten. It usually cannot tell you why. The difference between survival cannibalism and ritual cannibalism, between a mercy and a massacre, often lies in a motive that leaves no trace on the skeleton. Samples are small. Preservation is biased towards certain places like caves and bogs, and the sites we happen to dig are not a fair sample of the whole past. This is why careful researchers so often end with the words, "We do not fully know." That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story, the honest edge of what the evidence can carry. And because every new method reopens old cases, this is a field still very much in motion. None of this is settled history. The excavations at Atapuerca continue season after season, and each layer has the potential to push our understanding deeper still. Bogs across northern Europe keep giving up new bodies, and old ones are being re-examined with imaging and chemistry that Otto Bader and Robert Rudolf Schmidt could never have dreamed of. The revolution in ancient DNA is rewriting the kinship of sites that were dug decades ago, turning assumed families into networks of distant cousins and forcing every old story to be checked again. Isotope mapping is letting researchers trace the movement of prehistoric people across landscapes, which sharpens the question of who raided whom. The debate over Nataruk remains live in the journals, with new arguments over exactly what the injuries prove. Techniques like proteomics, which reads ancient proteins, are beginning to extend the reach of molecular study beyond the point where DNA itself breaks down, opening sites too old for genetics. Remote sensing and aerial survey keep finding new enclosures and mass graves that no one knew were there. The strange result of all this progress is that the picture is becoming more violent and more nuanced at the same time. Every new tool finds more evidence of ancient brutality, and also more evidence of the care, medicine, art, and social complexity that ran alongside it. The dark cases are multiplying, not because the past is getting worse, but because we are finally learning how to see it. This is a living field, not a closed book, and the next confirmed massacre, or the next cannibalized family, may already be sitting in a museum drawer, waiting for a method that has not been invented yet. Which brings us back to where we started, and to what all of this is really for. Return for a moment to that ditch at Herxheim, to the smooth cups of human bone shaped by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. That image is hard to hold, and it is meant to be. But it is not an aberration, not a monstrous exception to an otherwise gentle story. It is one thread in a pattern that runs through the whole of the human past, from an African lakeshore to a Spanish cave to an English bog. Our ancestors were fully human, and being fully human meant they were capable of all of it. The tenderness and the horror, the medicine and the massacre, often in the very same place. The past was neither a lost Eden nor a pit of pure savagery. It was something more difficult and more honest than either. And when we sand it down into a comfortable story, we lose something real. We lose the truth of who these people were, and in losing it, we lose a little of the truth about ourselves. The dead at Nataruk and Talheim and Crow Creek deserve accurate memory more than they deserve a myth. These theories are not fringe speculation. They are built on cut marks and isotopes and ancient DNA, argued over carefully by serious people, and they stay out of the books not because they are false, but because they are hard. The record is written in bone, in ochre, and in peat, and it is asking us to look at it clearly. The only real question left is whether we are willing to.